Welcome to Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a weekly look inside America's electoral system. I'm your host, Ben Ginsberg, and let me tell you a bit about this podcast series. Each Tuesday through a week after Election Day, and maybe more, we'll release a new podcast about voting in the upcoming election. We've called this Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, and that title is meant to be a bit of a Rorschach test. Who the saints and sinners are depends very much on which side of the ideological divide you sit in our highly polarized country. I've spent 4 decades as an attorney representing Republican candidates, political parties, donors, and elected officials. That work included spending election days looking at voting in precincts, states, and at the national level. I also co-chaired the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which, with the help of many elections officials, scholars, and participants in the political process, dug deeply into issues about voting. In this series, we'll look at our election and talk to the people who make them run, elect their candidates through it, and study it. Why this podcast? Well, the polls today show that 30% or more of the population does not have faith in the reliability of our election. Sustaining a democracy with that many people doubting where their vote counts is a huge danger for our country. That's where the salvageables come in. They're the people not intractably locked into a position who will decide if our system continues to work. It's our mandate in this podcast to look at and explain this issue from all perspectives. This week, we want to explore why the institution of voting is so important and fundamental to the United States from both a legal perspective and from a political science perspective. Joining me are Nate Persley, professor of law at Stanford, the co-director of the Healthy Elections Project, and the research director of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And Bruce Kane, preeminent and venerated professor of political science at Stanford and director of the Lane Center for the West. Both Nate and Bruce are prolific authors and have written numerous books and articles about voting in our political system. Well, welcome, Nate and Bruce. And we'd like to start out today with some of the basics. Nate, from a legal perspective, why do we hold elections? Why are they essential to the country and the way we govern ourselves?
Well, thanks for having me, Ben. And that is certainly a big question. Ironically, or I should say surprisingly, there is no right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. But we've had elections ever since the founding, and it has always been assumed that elections would be the way that we would certainly elect members of Congress, if not eventually the president. So the elections that are implicit in the Constitution, have over time we've expanded the franchise to include more and more people. Elections bring accountability, right? That democracy, as Churchill said, is the worst form of government besides all others. Through regular elections to Congress, for the president, that's how we keep our leaders accountable. I'll also say that, we hold more elections here in the United States than any other country in the world, that we elect everything, sometimes down to the dog catcher. And that makes us unique. And certainly those of us here in California know that we have, elections on any number of issues, referenda, and local offices up and down the ballot. So, it's the way that public sentiment gets translated into public policy. And we've been doing it for over 200 years.
And Bruce, from the perspective of political science, same question. Why do we hold them and why are they so essential?
I think Nate covered the most important point about accountability. And I think another way to say that is that it's the distinguishing feature, really, in many ways, between an autocracy and a democracy. That is, that we can remove people based on their performance or based on the changing preferences of the electorate. And that's not true in an autocracy. So it is not just an important feature, it really is a critical defining feature of what we mean by democracy. And then to build on the other point that Nate made, over time, what we think of as the importance of elections has only deepened over time. deepened in a variety of different ways. I mean, it's deepened in terms of the number of levels of government that we have elections on. And that's what Nate was referring to, that, we have, superintendents of schools, we have sheriffs, we have all kinds of people that are held accountable, including judges by elections. But also, we've extended it in terms of the breadth of who's included in voting. And we've extended the franchise over the last 2 centuries to include people that were previously excluded. And then most recently, in the last 100 years or so, we were even using it to determine policy per se, not just to elect candidates. And so we see, particularly at state and local governments, the proliferation of direct democracy that allows the people to directly change policy and institutional structure at the same time. So it's not only always been important in distinguishing us from autocracy, but it's gotten ever more important in all these different ways.
Well, you both described how essential voting is to the United States and our form of government, and really the basic protection. Nate, could you describe some of the legal protections that have grown up over time for the right to vote?
So one of the interesting features of the law of democracy, the class that I teach, and sometimes you teach with me here at Stanford, is that so much of the case law is really just created by judges, and that it doesn't spring all that much from statutes as opposed to from the Constitution. And what I mean by that is that, since the 1960s, judges have been much more aggressive in protecting the right to vote. Because although there is no specific provision granting the right to vote in federal elections in the Constitution, the courts since the 1960s have read it as if there is one. Now, of course, there are prohibitions in the Constitution to prevent discrimination with respect to race in the 15th Amendment, with respect to sex in the 19th Amendment, with respect to poll taxes or age in the later amendments. But none of them actually explicitly grant a constitutional right to vote. And so beginning in the 60s, the Supreme Court started interpreting the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, as basically guaranteeing a right to vote. And we do have congressional and certainly state action since then, which has increasingly protected the right to vote. And so most notably, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was an attempt to try to remedy this, the sort of long period of disenfranchisement that still afflicted African Americans even after the Civil War and the 15th Amendment. And so that was most influential in franchising the largest group of people starting in the 1960s. But the run-of-the-mill sort of legal environment that regulates elections, sort of the process of elections, is mostly at the state level. We don't have a national election authority, even though everybody sort of thinks we do, and most democracies have that. And so much of the regulation of voting and the regulation of elections is occurring at the state and sometimes at the local level.
Bruce, looking at some of your writings really as a jumping off point, free and fair elections and the right to vote form the foundation for virtually all of our institutions and norms. So how different would things be if losing candidates had refused over time to accept election results?
Well, that's a critical consideration. If you don't have closure, if you don't have finality, if you don't have acceptance, you're basically, going back to my previous point, undermining the legitimacy of democratic government and throwing us back into the potential of autocratic rule and abuse of power. So at some point, the distinguishing feature of a democracy has to be that you come to a decision and you accept the turnover of government. Now, it's not just a matter of people. One of the complicating things is that it's not just a matter of people agreeing to this in the abstract, because in the reality, you have to ask yourself the question, well, why do people want democracy, okay? And well, the answer is that you think it's fairer. For the most part, people consider it fair because everybody gets to have a voice, whereas in an autocracy, one or a few people have most of the decision making. But ultimately, there's a belief, I think, and it's that democracies produce better outcomes, that in the end, you're going to get policies that benefit the largest number of people over time, and that you will eventually, if you lose on a particular issue, you can win on some other issue in the future. And one of the problems, and I think one of the reasons why people flirt with the idea of getting rid of democracy, is it works best when people have the hope that someday they'll win under those rules or that they will benefit from it. And I think we have a group of people that, as a result of changes, some of which are completely outside the political system, having to do with the nature of the economy or the way in which people have moved from one culture to another. There's a group of people that really don't believe they have the capacity to win. And I think that leads them to think that, oh, the rules are unfair and therefore democracy needs to go. And that, of course, is a scary thing, because it will essentially undermine, as I said, the legitimacy of the system. But even if you don't worry about that, and the people that maybe want different outcomes don't worry about it, you have to realize that the switch back to autocracy gives rise to corruption and abuse of power. There's just lots of studies on this, because there's nobody to check the people at the top. There's nobody to catch the acts of corruption and essentially grifting and self-enrichment. So there are important reasons to preserve democracy, even though it seems like you're losing at the moment.
Nate, a somewhat more mechanical question. Each state, as you mentioned, states are really in charge of elections. Each state has a recount procedure or a contest procedure or litigation opportunities, or maybe all three, in the event a candidate doesn't believe in election results. But what would happen from a legal perspective if candidates just did not accept election results? What kind of protections are there in the law? What would litigation look like?
To some extent, it depends what position we're talking about, because some positions need to be, filled at the expiration of the previous term. So, for example, for the presidency, there's a specific process that would be in place, the unique process, as we saw, somewhat play out on January 6th, as well as the machinery that's in the Constitution for filling vacancies. If for example, there were no electoral college vote for a particular president, a presidential candidate. So, but speaking in general about what happens if someone, does not accept the outcome. I mean, so there's the normal processes of contesting and asking for a recount in election, and you are the world expert on this, having done so many recounts. And look, just because someone, we've got the judicial process that candidates will go through. There's a final outcome. The court then will declare, and the appellate courts will then affirm who is the sort of rightful victor in a particular race. And then, if there's still dispute, then the courts will essentially protect that candidate who they've ordered to be the actual winner in the case, to be the sort of rightful owner of that office. Rightful holder of that office. I think that it really does depend at kind of which stage that we're talking about. Something, as you've litigated, Ben, in congressional elections, sometimes there will be congressional seats that will remain open for some period, depending on disputes and recounts, et cetera. And then, of course, for Congress, sometimes you have the body itself, like the House of Representatives, since the Constitution gives the power to each body to be the judge of its own the returns of its members. You could have, as you've litigated, situations where members of the Congress itself refuses to seat certain individuals. So that's in a nutshell, I think, all the different ways that you could see the courts or the Congress involved in ratifying elections.
And it's really important as people look at this area and potential disruptions that might occur in 2022, is to remember just how different it is from a presidential race where the Electoral College is a unique animal that applies only to presidential races. But if there are disputes over the rightful winners of congressional and legislative states elections, then it is the body, the House or the Senate itself, who will decide who its own members are. And there's certainly room for some legal and political gamesmanship in all of that. So I want to turn a little bit to elections and how they work. The last big hiccup that Nate referred to was the Florida recount in 2000 before this latest election. And in the wake of that, there were an awful lot of laws and improvements that have been made since then to voting. Bruce, can you discuss a little bit? And I should reemphasize that you have represented candidates in the redistricting process, seen elections up close, commented on it. How have you seen elections change since 2000, and are they better?
In some ways, obviously, we adopted legislation after 2000 that fixed some of the problems that we had at the time. Some of the solutions we had to abandon. We thought maybe we could move to, completely computerized online voting, and we decided that wasn't a good idea. But nonetheless, I think, we did move some steps forward in terms of improving the actual electoral administration. But there are some 3 or 4 things that I think are just kind of residual problems that kept it from being as successful as we would like it to be. And the first is we just never finished what a lot of other democracies have done, which is completely professionalize our administration of elections. We still have a large number of partisan election officials. And we saw in the 2000 election that it was Democrats that were concerned about some of the Republican officials, just as many of the Republicans right now are skeptical about what some of the Democratic appointees did. And a lot of us that have followed this for a long time have said, look, we should be more like the rest of the world. We should really try to inoculate this and not have people that have party labels on them making these kinds of decisions. But that doesn't seem to go very far. The second thing is there are actual value differences that have changed over time. The policy questions that underlie election administration. So when you make decisions about who should vote or how easy it should be vote or how to trade off the security of the ballot with convenience, reasonable people can disagree. So underneath what are sometimes irrational and highly heated debates are actually some important trade-off questions that have real, a basis to them that make it hard to make these choices. So there are real value differences. And then, of course, when it gets to the political realm, you've got the fact that we have a highly professionalized politics these days that takes a different view about election administration, and they see it as part of their tactical war. That is, how can they gain an advantage over the other? So there's a lot of gaming the rules that goes on both sides that makes it very hard to sort of have this be a sort of, if you like, an academic or a neutral discussion. And finally, I think one thing we have to realize is, given the complexity and the number of elections we have and the number of volunteers we have running the system, there's no way that we're ever going to run 100% perfect, clean elections. There's always going to be a few people that vote for the wrong reasons, or either intentionally or unintentionally. There's always going to be mistakes made, ballots that are floating in the water, things like that. And so unfortunately, the fact that we can't guarantee 100% perfection means that there's always going to be things that people can grab a hold of to make people lose faith in the system as a whole. And I'm not sure that any of those problems that I just mentioned are ever going to go away. They're always going to be part of how you have to wrestle with the problem of election administration.
And Nate, how do you see elections evolving since 2000?
Well, I think, we have made great strides in election administration over the last 22 years. And I think, given the polarization over the electoral system now, it's sometimes easy to lose sight of that. But on the basic questions of something like lost votes, which is to say the number of votes that are intended to be cast but that are not counted, we've made great strides so that there were millions of ballots that were not counted back in 2000 that now, because of technological administrative changes, are going to be counted. So we shouldn't lose sight of that, as well as the ease with which we have made voting over that time period. So the expansion of early voting, expansion of mail balloting. There's a reason we saw unprecedented turnout in the last election, despite incredible odds given the pandemic. All that being said, what Bruce says is true, which is that now the basic machinery of democracy has become a partisan, polarized flashpoint. And so that there are other sort of forces coming in the other direction to make voting more difficult, to regulate it, et cetera. Now, but I do think that the bottom line is that we have radically improved election administration in this country over those 20 plus years. And the fruits of that labor and effort were shown in the last election. I think there are new problems, right? And one of the things, that we in the field know is that there's never, it's not like we're always sort of getting better and it's a straight line. There's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of process here in order to deal with, really sort of new challenges, and COVID was the most recent one. I do think that the issue of partisan election administration that Bruce raised is an absolutely critical one, so that I think that we are lurching toward sort of greater infection of partisanship in the administrative process, particularly at the state level, and we got to be worried about that, as well as all these new issues that are being raised by election denialism in the wake of the 2020 election. And so those are new challenges that need to be met in the courts or, through activism.
So let's talk a little bit more about the 2020 election and election denialism, which is, after all, why this podcast now exists. So just for people listening to this, do you believe our elections are accurate? You believe that the mechanisms are in place to provide accurate vote counts should people have faith in the election results? Bruce?
Well, I think they should. It certainly bothers me that a lot of people don't right now. And I think this requires us to go back, even though we believe, I think a lot of us that work professionally and have worked with registrars and gone to these meetings and, looked at the academic evidence, even though we're convinced that the system really has not degraded in any way, and as Nate said, really has improved enormously. I think we have to take the appearance of lack of legitimacy, even if the reality doesn't justify that perception. I think we have to take it seriously, and we have to figure out, well, what is it? It may be things that are correctable. For example, it may be that delaying counts as a result of absentee ballots for many weeks at the end of an election is really not a practice that we should allow to be widespread, because I think it just probably does feed suspicion, because people come to see one outcome and then a couple of days later a different outcome after the election. So I think we have to go beyond the reality of a system with integrity to maybe think a little bit more about what it is we can do that it helps with the perception per se.
Nate?
Yes, I have confidence in the American electoral system and certainly in the results of the 2020 vote. I agree with Bruce that it, in some ways, it doesn't make a difference how well the machinery is working if people don't have confidence in it. And while we see, particular lack of confidence on the Republican side following the 2020 election, I think there's a chance we'll see the same thing on the Democratic side following 2022. And trust in elections is not easy to win back once it's been lost. We know that from other countries. And so we're in a very precarious moment. But the election machinery, the process of casting and counting votes is done very well in the US. Now, like everything else in the American electoral system, the states and localities differ from each other. And so the processes that they use and the technology, as well as the systems that are in place, and the possibility that partisanship will infect the vote counting process, those are different risks depending on which state or locality that we're talking about. But the basic machinery of US elections is secure.
So what do each of you say to the growing percentage of the population, now roughly 30% in polls, who say they do not believe the election results? What's your message to them to give them confidence that the results are accurate? Bruce?
Well, I think to give them the message, we have to understand a little bit more about why they believe that way. I think there's more work to be done to really figure out how much of it is just the artifact of the COVID election. We know that the suspicion about this precedes it. That is to say, we know that this concern about fraud has been building in the ranks of particularly of the Republican Party, but there were episodes where there was concerns about the machines back in 2002. So that paranoia about the system has certainly been there forever, but it's really ticked up. And I think we are going to have to try to more about why that's the case. And that's why I think this next election for me is very critical. I want to see if that number bends down, because remember, there are a lot of Republican and Democratic incumbents who, once they win, they're not anxious to have the system undermined. So it's possible that we've hit the high point in this mistrust, and that we need to work to keep driving it down further, but that we'll see in this next election something a little bit like a more normal understanding of the flaws and advantages of the system we have.
Nate, your message to people who don't believe that elections are accurate?
So long as partisan elites continue to send the message that the election infrastructure is insecure or that the 2020 election is marred by fraud, the mass public who looks to them for signals is going to believe that the election system is insecure and marred by fraud. I mean, there's almost nothing that we can do on the outside to counteract the large megaphones that political elites have. And the fact that you now have a sizable number of candidates that are running on the fraud of the 2020 election as being the kind of cornerstone of their campaigns, that tells you everything you need to know. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to kind of wrench that principle, that motivating factor from the messaging that's coming out related to this election. We can do all kinds of things related to mail voting or related to auditing or other stuff. But what we've seen in the wake of the 2020 election is that none of that really matters in terms of people's confidence, because the claims about fraud are so heterogeneous, right? So whether it's Chinese ballots in Arizona or Dominion voting systems, or the long arm of Hugo Chavez from Venezuela is influencing the election, or dead people voting, or all kinds of theories about, or Italian satellites was another theory. There's a whack-a-mole problem when it comes to trying to address these concerns about fraud, when really what's happening is that elites are sending this message, and then the mass public that ordinarily is not really paying attention to questions of election mechanics will then ally themselves with that principle as articulated by the leaders of their tribe. And I agree with Bruce that this is something, as I was saying before, I do worry that it's going to actually have a more bipartisan flavor coming out of the 2022 elections, especially if the Democrats lose Congress. But since 2020, it has become a rallying cry on the Republican side, because President Trump is not agreed to the outcome of the 2020 election.
So what's the antidote for that, gentlemen? How do you fix this? Bruce?
Yeah, I mean, again, both Nate and I have spoken out for trying to make the whole process more nonpartisan, but that doesn't seem to be in the cards right now. And so we're looking increasingly, I think, to bipartisan efforts to try to get, as Nate said, the leaders of both what he calls the tribes, call them the parties, call them the sides of the ideological divide. I think that you have to build from there. You have to build not from the extremes, but from the mainstream part of the leadership in both parties to develop a consensus about what is the status of the system and what can actually be gamed and what shouldn't be gamed, and patch up whatever holes there are in the system that need to be fixed. But I think it's going to take that bipartisan cooperation. We're not going to get to a nonpartisan. The American public's never going to believe an anonymous bureaucracy anyway. So we got to really just treat this as an area where there has to be a bipartisan consensus, just as we did with foreign policy. In our best years as an international power, I think there's got to be a bipartisan consensus between the leadership. And as Nate said, I think that will then permeate down into the ranks and start to reverse this very dangerous trend.
Nate?
Well, I think that it's very hard to predict what the next few years holds. I think, for example, an election in which Donald Trump is running in 2024 is different than one where he's not. And the centrality of the kind of look back to 2020, it will be different depending on who the candidates are. And look, I am very concerned about the rising tide of election denialism in the US. And I don't think there is an easy fix because the belief has become so entrenched already. You can't dislodge it at this point from those who believe that the 2020 election was filled with fraud. And unless one sees, major changes in different states, I think that, that those concerns will continue on among certain people. But as with all aspects of polarization, there are events that could happen that could sort of distract and maybe scramble some of the strategies and coalitions that currently exist. And so we will see. My big concern right now is actually that it will not shrink the number of people who believe that the election infrastructure is insecure and has potential for fraud, but I think it may actually expand it. And that's because while right now there's a kind of partisan structure to opinion on vote fraud and the security of the electoral system, that once that becomes bipartisan, it's going to be very difficult to win back confidence.
And of course, one of the great difficulties in this whole process is those bipartisan efforts that you talked about. The real challenge is to find adherents to election denialism who are willing to sit down and talk with people who do believe in elections. And that is a partisan problem. It's not a question of getting a few Republicans into those efforts. It's a question of finding adherents of election denial being able to do that. And that's what the real challenge is. We will endeavor on this podcast to provide a forum for all views on this subject, because it's important to understand as well what people who do not believe in the accuracy of elections think and why they think it. I want to turn to for a second on the impact on our institution. This is the not so pretty picture of nightmare scenarios. What happens if there is this bipartisan denial of elections accuracy? Where does the country go? How do the institutions hold to keep the country on track? Nate, that's probably a legal question in part. So why don't we start with you?
Well, let me raise a concern that I have that I don't think has been voiced before, which is that, one consequence of declining confidence in elections is that, all right, people lose faith in the democracy, they're less likely to accept winners and the like. But I think there's also another risk here, which is that the more that people just see this as a game and that there is less confidence in the infrastructure, the more that elites or people who are participants in the system might actually commit wrongdoing, whether it's fraud or active disenfranchisement or violence, et cetera. And so that I'm worried that one of the consequences of this lack of confidence is that folks frankly on either side may feel that that it's incumbent upon them to sort of color outside the lines or to do things that they haven't done historically. So that's one point. The second is just, you were asking the institutional question. These Secretary of State races in the 2022 election are more important than they've probably ever been in U.S. history. And who is leading, particularly in the battleground states, and who's going to administer these elections and how they're going to behave is absolutely critical. And we have people who are election denialists who are running for some of those offices. In addition, I want to throw my weight behind and amplify how important local election officials are, most of whom are, just trying to get the job done. And who are very management oriented, trying to shuttle voters through the process, trying to just not end up on the front pages. And so we have a record number of retirements in the last few years among local officials, which concerns me. And some of whom just, who are receiving death threats and other uncomfortable aspects of their office, who are resigning as a result. And we really need to sort of rush to protect them. That's true for federal law enforcement. It's true for civil society, and really true for the media, to try to emphasize these people are your neighbors. These people are the people who are from your local community, just trying to keep elections safe and secure.
I agree with everything that Nate said, but I think there's another dimension of this, which is that what happens in the economic sector is very much influenced by the political sector. Yes, there's the possibility of riots. Yes, there's the possibility of various forms of political instability. And then the question is, well, what does it mean outside of the political realm per se? And the answer is that capitalism depends very much on having a secure political system. So what you're messing with is not just who gets to sit in those offices in DC, but the assurances that businesses have that laws are going to be enforced, that contracts will happen, that regulations are going to be of a certain sort, all the kinds of things that the business community needs in order to operate. So you're not just striking at the roots of democracy, you're striking at the roots of capitalism. And I think that's going to get people's attention, because if it really fundamentally undermines the economy, it will have effects in terms of our ability to be an economic power as well as the political power. So I think we're touching some very, very important aspects of the way America is organized right now. And I think that you'd hate to have to wait until all these things actually start going south on us before we recognize the foolishness of the path we're on.
Where do you each think the solution to this problem is going to come from? Is it going to come from political elites? Does it need to come from the business community? Is it a solution that is only achieved at the ballot box on elections?
I think it's all of the above. Okay, I think it's all of the above, and I'm sure Nate's going to say the same thing. We both believe that it's all the above, and I think it starts with steps like fixing some of the holes, like in the Electoral Count Act, gradually addressing some of the additional problems. But I think again, it's got to be a consensus of people in business, people in the political realm that are in elected office at state and local levels, it's election administrators. It's got to be the consensus of all these groups, the nonprofit groups, that the shrill voices, the misleading claims, et cetera, have to be pushed back against. And I think it takes every sector to really fight this.
Nate, anything to add to that?
Well, I agree. We need an all hands on deck approach. One group that I think you left out was the media. I think that we need both social media and legacy media to commit themselves to responsible reporting on election, infrastructure issues, and that's part of the challenge these days, is that people are getting their information from quite diverse array of sources. And if you are looking for someone to say our election is fraudulent, you will be able to find it. But ultimately, it really just depends on what message is coming from political elites. And so if you had a more complicated message that was coming out that didn't have the same kind of partisan structure that we've seen in the last 3 years, then that would make a huge difference. And like I said, we tend to focus on the here and now and what's happened in the wake of the last election. But a lot can change over these next few years. And whether it's new issues, new candidates, new strategies, new foreign policy crises that could sort of shift our attention and make us think a little bit differently about some of the controversies that have preoccupied us for the last 2 years.
And one of the things I do want to highlight as we go through this podcast series will be the ongoing campaign this time. You both mentioned fulcrums or pivot points where things can change. One of those, of course, will be the elections in 2022 for the Secretary of State races that Nate mentioned, but also if election denial overall is a electorally successful strategy or unsuccessful strategy, will have a huge amount to do with the messaging of elites. So I want to close by taking a look at something we'll be talking about more next week, which is what happens if election deniers running for office are actually successful. You've both studied the political process. If a Secretary of State who is an election denier wins, what are you most worried about that they could do that would impact free and fair elections?
So, look, the secretaries of state and the power of their office varies by state, and so it's not as if just because someone's secretary of state they can somehow declare the loser the winner, and so it really just depends on the kind of message that they are sending and the sort of long arm of that office into the local election offices. In some ways, the extreme decentralization of the U.S. election system, which many of us lament, is also a buttress against excessive partisanship at the state or national level. So, it really depends on the state and what message they're sending. Now, one of the things that I'm concerned about is the number of disputed ballots that may come out of this next election because of all the new laws, because there may be voter confusion as well as poll worker and election official confusion. And so in those situations where sort of the election is within the margin of error, the Secretary of State can sometimes play a role in terms of issuing opinions as to which votes are valid, which are invalid, and similar issues.
Yeah, I mean, I take some comfort in the fact that in some of these cases, the election denying people are in deeply partisan states of one sort or another, usually red. But obviously, my greater concern is that when we get to that smaller subset of important state races in competitive states, certainly in the midterm and then later in the presidential, that's where, even though, as Nate said, the number of such people is very tiny, they could have an impact that exceeds their numbers. And so that's something we have to watch very closely. I mean, if somebody is very skeptical about Democratic voters in Utah, depending upon what part of Utah, they're not going to do as much damage. But when we get into Ohio or we get into Pennsylvania or some of these other states, that's where I think the concern could exceed their numbers in terms of a fraction of administrators that are inclined that way.
Well, because we always hope to close these episodes on a positive note, you both have been incredibly articulate in describing the problems and offering some solution. But I'd like you now to wave your magic electoral wand and tell us how we, what the solutions are to this problem. What are the three best things the country can do to get back on a footing where there is more universal belief in the accuracy of elections?
So let's start with something that's really necessary and has been lacking for a decade or more, which is adequate funding of the election infrastructure. I think a lot can be done by local officials if they have the resources that they need in order to run an efficient election that is secure. And you know, in the wake of the 2020 election, where there was a lot of investment to deal with things like mail voting in states that didn't have a history of it, you know, there's a lot of it's important that these funds be there, that the local officials not go hat in hand either to legislatures or to private entities in order to get the money. So I think that if we get real investment in our democracy, I think the local officials will figure out ways to get people through the process. And like I said, I do want to sing their praises and rally the troops for them, because I think the local officials are the unsung heroes of our democracy.
Bruce?
Yeah, I certainly think that you know, adequately funding state and local, or especially local offices, is very important. Because as Nate said, a lot of that work is done at the local level and often by volunteers. And by the way, within counties and cities, it's the election office which gets the, you know, the least consideration. So as compared to police and fire, and understandably, but that's the way it is. But, you know, I do think that we have to, in addition to putting money into helping the administration, I think we have to put much more effort into looking at what increases confidence. And so I'm going to give a very classical academic answer and say more money into the research of what it is that makes a difference in terms of people's confidence in the system, and what are they most worried about, and how can we address it. I realize that may come across as self-serving, although, to be honest, I'm unlikely to be the beneficiary of such money, but it is nonetheless the case that I do think that systematic study of different types of efforts to bolster the confidence could be important to improving it in the future.
Excellent. Well, Nate Persley and Bruce Kane, thank you so much for joining us here on Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a weekly look inside America's electoral system. We will be back with another episode next week. Thank you.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcasts, or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.